those lyrics come from what many call the definitive hard rock album, both musically and financially. In fact, it is the second best-selling album of all time, with 31 million units sold, second only to Michael Jackson's Thriller, which has a reported total of 51 million copies sold. But it's Back in Black that has had this strange conspiracy revolving around it practically since it hit the store shelves, one that even divides AC/DC's most hardcore fans. And that is, who actually wrote the lyrics? You may think, who cares really? But this is actually one of the biggest conspiracies in the history of rock and roll. And it's somewhat strange that, on the second best-selling album of all time, there's such a controversy on the alleged lyricist. But before we get into that, let's look at how we got here. On February 17th, 1975, AC/DC would release their debut album called High Voltage, which was originally released in Australia and New Zealand alone. It would be the following year when it would get an international release, and while it featured a band who was still young and coming into their own, it set the stage for things to come. And I guess it's important now to list the band members for this album, which was Bon Scott, the lead singer and main writer of the band, along with Angus Young, lead guitar and supporting writer, Malcolm Young, his brother, who played rhythm guitar and supporting writer, and then the band was rounded out by an assortment of contributors: Rob Bailey, Peter Clack, George Young, another brother and producer, and Tony Currenty. But for our story, the focus will be on Bon, Angus, and Malcolm. Now between 1975 and 1978, the band would release 4 more albums, before releasing Highway to Hell in 1979, which would finally bring the band into the mainstream, and would serve as the launch pad for the following album, Back in Black. But this period would end up being one of the more tragic in AC/DC's history, because Bon Scott, their powerful singer, writer, and main creative force in the band, would die on February 19th, 1980, at the age of 32, due to alcohol poisoning. Now this is a conspiracy unto itself, but that's not the one we are going to cover, because after Bon's death, the Young brothers, the ones that owned the band, would employ Geordie singer Brian Johnson 2 months later. And within a few weeks, the band allegedly wrote and recorded the second best-selling album of all time, which of course made many fans skeptical, and there's good reason for that. One of the main being that rock albums take some time to write, record, and produce. In fact, the average hard rock album takes between a half a year and a year and a half to produce, although garage bands and punk bands can finish within 1 to 3 months, but in our case, it took 7 weeks, and that came after the band's creative force died. And I know you may say, well, AC/DC is not the apex of lyrical writing, let's be honest, and you're correct. However, up to this point, the band had taken an average of 3 months per album, 3 times longer than the amount of time that it took Back in Black to be written, and that's caused numerous stories to pop up over the years which claim Bon Scott actually wrote the album Back in Black, not Brian Johnson, which the Young brothers allege. And this is not something new. Actually, pretty much as soon as the album debuted, many were quick to point out that these lyrics sounded very close to what Bon would write. However, the Young brothers were quick to come out and state that the rumors were not true, and that the album had been completely written by Johnson. And it's his account that is equally as strange. He would claim in several interviews over the years that after being employed with the band, they would fly to the Bahamas to begin work on the album. And it's here Johnson sat down to write the lyrics, and he claimed a spirit entered the room. One he assumed was Bon, and his pen began to flow by itself. He guided it, but the spirit was in charge of what was being written. As you can imagine, that has raised many eyebrows. But that's not the only thing odd about this story, because see, Brian Johnson, in spite of being a great singer, is a terrible lyricist. And that's not just me saying that. This comes from Brian Johnson himself, who has stated in several interviews that he could not write a lick. In fact, the band that he had came from, Geordie, had featured him as the vocalist on 3 albums, and he never wrote one lyric for them. But that brings us back to the studio, where Bon's ghost allegedly took control of his ink pen and wrote the entire album. But there's other stories that contradict the narrative too. After decades of claiming Bon did not contribute to Back in Black, in the 2000s, specifically 2021, Angus in an interview would now claim that Bon indeed did contribute, but it was only drums, specifically that he laid down drums to Hell's Bells and Have a Drink on Me, although a year later, he would cite that he also did drums for Let Me Put My Love Into You. But there's even more accounts that back the conspiracy, like the night that Bon died, when he drank way too much. Several of his friends would cite that Bon told them that he was out celebrating the completion of writing the next album, which he had kept in a notebook. This notebook was spotted by several witnesses, and it vanished upon his death. The story has always been that the Young brothers collected all Bon's belongings upon his death and flew them back to his family in Australia. Everything except that special notebook, which according to them, they never seen again. And it's apparently lost, or so they claim. However, upon flying back to see Bon's family, they did get them to sign a non-disclosure agreement and then promised the family royalty fees for the upcoming album, which again, according to them, Bon had nothing to do with. They explained these royalty fees as a token of appreciation, a gift, but you could see where someone might suspect something else. Regardless, Bon's family would never speak publicly on the matter, which takes us to the next part. One of Bon's old friends from the band The Valentines, Vince Lovegrove, has outright stated this is what happened, and that the royalty fees were in exchange for not telling anyone that Bon wrote the album. His account is important because he lived near and stayed in contact with Bon's family, specifically Bon's mother, who died in 2011. Then we go to one of Bon's girlfriends, who went on to have a prestigious professional position, and because of that, has went under the pseudonym of Holly X, understandably, to avoid being hassled by rock fans. She has granted very few interviews over the years, and only interviews that can guarantee her identity will be kept secret. And she confirmed not only did the notebook of lyrics exist, but several of them were slightly changed by the time they made it to the album, maybe in a way to justify not citing Bon as the contributor. Then we have to look at writing styles. Back in Black mirrors Highway to Hell and Let There Be Rock, the last two Bon albums, more than the albums that came out after Back in Black. In fact, just a couple of albums after Back in Black, Johnson would be sacked from lyrics duty, citing the fact that the albums after were received so poorly, with a noticeable decline in lyrics and creative direction. But now we get to the last, most important part of this story, that of the Young brothers. When one thinks of AC/DC, you don't typically think of image, but actually, it's something the two brothers have long worked on. They have spent decades pushing the narrative that AC/DC is the band of the everyday working man, a guy who works 40 hours a week, goes to a bar on Friday night for a game of pool and a few beers. But outside that image, the Youngs are very cutthroat businessmen with a history of being unsympathetic to bandmates, like the original bassist, Mark Evans, who appeared on the first 4 albums and was fired abruptly at a meeting where Angus refused to even look at him, or another time when Angus allegedly punched Evans, and even removing his name from the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame ballot and rescinding his invite. Then there's the longtime drummer, Phil Rudd, who was punched by Angus for being late for a show before being promptly fired. We can even take a look at Brian Johnson himself, who was basically told he was not a bandmate, but an employee of the band. In fact, Johnson in 2016, after being part of the band for 36 years, confided to the Youngs that after seeing a doctor, it was recommended he stop performing due to hearing loss. He asked the Youngs to give him some time to talk to some other medical experts to see if there was a way around it. But after asking to keep it a secret, the very next day, the Youngs announced that Brian was deaf and was out of the band and they were looking for a new singer. They then sent him his suitcases and hired Axl Rose within a few weeks. I must clarify here though, the Youngs have since came out and stated he was never fired, although they did seem to say that only after they got tons of bad press. Brian did get back with the band though, and is with them today. But it's Brian that's also noted other strange habits of the Youngs over the years. Like in 1985, in an interview, he would explain what it was like working with them on albums. He stated they would always hire expensive producers who would come in and listen to the music and then give their advice on what to change, which the Youngs always ignored, so they were essentially paid to just listen. Something that baffled Johnson, who by that point was removed from any creative contributions to the albums, if he ever contributed anything at all, that is. But now we come to the most important part of this strange conspiracy. Why lie about it? What would be the reason in wiping away Bond's contribution? According to the theory, the main reason was to show critics that the band would carry on without Bond. After the release of Highway to Hell, Bond's stardom had reached new heights, and he was quickly becoming the face of the band, much to the chagrin of the Young brothers. And if their first album with a new singer bombed, the band was essentially finished. In fact, most critics at the time had pretty much written them off after Bond's untimely death, so the best course of action was to take the reliable words from Bond's notebook and give credit to the new guy. This would be much safer than letting an unproven or bad writer take on the challenge. Or at least that's what the conspiracy says. A conspiracy that lives on today. So, who really wrote Back in Black? Let me know what you think below.